Hello, my name is Jennifer. Would you like to discuss the meaning of life? Isn't really a socially acceptable intro, apparently. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Neurodivergent, where I make content about being a neurodivergent female diagnosed with autism and ADHD. As promised in my introductory video, in this video, I'm going to do a deeper dive into some of my traits with specific examples and stories to try to give you a better idea of what it's like inside here. But because there's so much to go over on this subject, I ended up having to break it up into 3 parts. I made my own Netflix mini docuseries, y'all. So buckle up and maybe, I don't know, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss parts 2 and 3 of my telenovela because, you know, our people don't like to be left hanging without resolution. But before I get started, it's important to remember that people on the spectrum mask to hide their traits as a compensatory strategy so that they can pass for neurotypical. Women are even more adept at this on average, which is part of the reason they oftentimes go undiagnosed. On top of all of that, psychologist Tania Marshall said that, and I quote, "The pretty princess types or feminine looking women have an even harder time getting diagnosed." Not trying to call myself a princess.
Who's pretty? Who's a pretty princess?
Just giving you the full Tania Marshall quote because I do present very feminine. But women have a hard enough time being believed as it is. So hopefully this will be a good exercise for some to check their biases and preconceived notions about what autism and ADHD looks like. Basically, people won't see the majority of my traits unless they live with me or they're inside my head. And fun fact, my husband is the only adult that lives with me and sees the real me that exists behind closed doors. And I'm the only one that lives inside my head. Now, it can be difficult explaining my neurotype because I have both ADHD and autism, and most resources separate them out. How do I explain the autism diagnosis criteria, which is sometimes masked by my ADHD, and vice versa? I decided it's just best to explain them separately for now, and I'll get into the overlap and differences between the two in a future video. The DSM-5 basically breaks the criteria for an autism diagnosis into 2 main categories. Category 1 addresses deficits in social communications and interactions, while Category 2 addresses restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior. The social deficits are what I'll be going over in this video. And when we say social deficits, it's not just being an introvert. It's not even social anxiety, although that is an accompanying factor a lot of the time. It's deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors, in social emotional reciprocity, and developing and maintaining relationships. It's absence of interest in peers, reduced sharing of interests, failure to understand social cues, and failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. Anyway, typical disclaimers, I'm not a psychologist or a mental health professional, and I don't claim to be. The only thing I'm an expert on is my own experience. So here I am, simply sharing my story. And I'm not just doing this so I can go on the internet and talk about myself. I'm doing this so that other viewers might relate or feel less alone. So let's get started. Why do people on the spectrum struggle with social interactions exactly? The term autism was first used by psychiatrist Eugene Bleuler in 1908. Bleuler? The Greek word autos means self, and the word autism was originally used by Eugene to describe self-admiration and withdrawal within oneself. While the self-admiration piece might be misplaced for a lot of us, the withdrawn part might be more relatable for the majority of us. Many autistics describe feeling so different from general society that they've reported feeling like they were aliens. This phenomena has been called having wrong planet syndrome by some. I heard an interview with a newly diagnosed pastor, and he said he'd always felt like the whole world was in on an inside joke that he just didn't understand, and I thought that was pretty descriptive to how it feels. The culprit behind this feeling is a myriad of factors that make us feel like we just don't fit in with society. Personally, I sometimes feel like my brain thinks in an in-depth alien language that has no human words for translation, and it's left me struggling to communicate my thoughts and ideas with others. People have a lot of misconceptions about what autism is. Some people think it means being intellectually disabled or a savant, but that's not accurate. There can be an accompanying intellectual disability, but that would be considered a comorbidity, not a part of autism. You can have autism without intellectual disability, but you can't have autism without the social deficits. Autism actually has very little to do with a person's intelligence. Although autism is complex with a lot of traits and components, the social deficits piece is a major factor. It's not being quirky, it's not intellectual disability or savantism. It's mostly always feeling different from everyone else and struggling with most aspects of social communication and interaction. That is going to be the theme of this entire video. So what do you think of when you hear social deficits in communication and interaction? Maybe you think of a child lining up toys instead of playing cops and robbers with the other children. You might think of a child self-isolating, or maybe you think of a situation where one kid pushes the ball to the other, but the child on the receiving end doesn't understand back and forth play. So rather than pass it back, he just picks it up and stares at it. Those might be some good examples of what deficits in social interactions could look like for a child. But what does this look like when you're an adult? Because most adults aren't sitting on the floor passing a ball back and forth. I'll do my best to describe what deficits in social reciprocity and communication look like for me. For starters, I don't initiate social interaction. As an adult, that's typically done through text messages and phone calls, neither of which I initiate. I don't think to randomly reach out to someone just to say hi or to check in on them. It's always other people reaching out to me first and me responding, but I don't even do that well. I will go days without responding to a text message or a voicemail from someone. I don't like making or receiving phone calls. I mean, getting an unexpected phone call can feel like the panic of being ambushed at midnight on a subway train. I sometimes have to let it go to voicemail so I can mentally prepare myself to call that person back. Responding to text messages or returning phone calls takes a lot of energy out of me. It's obviously not a time issue because it takes all of 10 seconds to reply to a text. It's a mental hang-up for me. I feel like I have to have the perfect response or an abundant amount of energy. What is so simple for everyone else feels extremely overwhelming and becomes a huge daunting task to me. Most people will never understand how simply responding to a text message or returning a phone call can feel like gearing up to climb Mount Everest for someone like me. It reminds me of that meme that says, "Is there an emoji for I saw your text but didn't know how to perfectly respond to it, so I waited until I knew exactly what to say, but it's been 3 weeks now, so I just feel microbursts of shame every time I see your name in the elephant graveyard of messages on my phone. Excuse me, sir, can you take this post down? I'm in it and I don't like it." I also don't initiate plans for social gatherings and activities. I'll respond to invites, but not create them. Imagine how hard it is to keep friendships when you seem selfish and one-sided because you don't reach out or ask people to get together. What I'm explaining is literally described in the DSM-5 as failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. But this is what the adult representation of this might look like. Now, before we go any further, I want to point out that the motivation behind a behavior, the persistency, and the impact it has on your day-to-day living makes a big difference. You might relate to this specific example, but let's look at why you're not great at responding to text messages. Is it because you often don't have time or get easily distracted, or maybe just don't check your phone that often? Or was it because you feel paralyzed by dread, overwhelm, and lack the energy needed to reciprocate that social interaction, even though you want to? Does it take a huge amount of energy to respond to a text message? If it's something similar to the latter, it could be autism. It's a good exercise to examine the motivation behind any traits you might relate to in this video and how much impact it has on you, because just having similar behaviors isn't enough. Difficulty with responding to my peers causes me stress and anxiety and interferes with my personal relationships. And it's so consistent that it was one of my New Year's resolutions to improve on for about a decade before my diagnosis. I do tend to self-isolate, and the mechanisms by which I achieve this include not making plans with people, getting excited about canceled plans, or hiding away in my bedroom when I feel overwhelmed. I also don't do well at showing interest in other people's lives or remembering facts about them. Whenever neurotypicals meet up, I see them ask things like, "How did your vacation in Sarasota go?" Or, "Were you ever able to get Timmy into that new preschool you were talking about?" And embarrassingly enough, I just can't seem to master this concept. I don't think about incorporating recent events like weather or holidays into conversations, and I don't think about asking people about stuff going on in their lives. Why does this come so easily to other people and is not intuitive to me? And it's not because I don't care. I'll actually think about a person a lot throughout the day, but they'd never know it based on our one-sided interactions. I feel like I'm always reactionary in a social context, never proactive. And the thing is, I'm painfully self-aware. I know what appropriate social behavior looks like, but it's not intuitive. I can and do force myself to reciprocate and show interest in others all the time. It just doesn't come naturally to me, and it's something I have to use cognitive behavioral effort to accomplish. Anyway, let's move on to some of my deficits in nonverbal communication. I absolutely struggle with eye contact. Funny enough, I can look someone in the eyes when they are talking, but not when I'm speaking. The difficulty autistics have with eye contact varies from person to person. Some people on the spectrum will report the opposite of my issue, meaning they can look someone in the eyes when they themselves are talking, but not when the other person is talking. Or they may not be able to make eye contact at all in either scenario. Looking someone in the eyes when I'm trying to talk can be so distracting, I can't focus on what I'm trying to say. It also gives me a great deal of discomfort. It's hard to describe the feeling exactly, but it makes me feel naked, exposed, and self-conscious. But like many of you, I have found ways around it. I've looked in the center of people's eyes to make it seem like I'm making eye contact, or more commonly, I'll look at them for a second, then look away like I'm naturally just, viewing the decor next to them or something. And I've noticed that my ability to make eye contact gets worse the more tired I am. And there's no discrimination on who I do and don't feel comfortable making eye contact with, because it's not about them. I have difficulty making eye contact with my own husband. This caused some concern for him before my diagnosis because eye contact is often viewed as a form of intimacy and connection, and I couldn't always do it. He did bring it up before my diagnosis. And as I mentioned in my first video, it was noticeable enough that someone asked me why I wasn't making eye contact during a work Zoom call. Now let's talk about another deficit in nonverbal communication, which is my lack of facial expressions.
What's wrong with your face?
Naturally, my facial expressions and body language want to be flat and neutral, regardless of my mood or situation. Therefore, my face might erroneously communicate concern, boredom, or annoyance. Or my facial expressions may not show the appropriate amount of gratitude when receiving a gift, for example, leading people to think I'm disappointed in what they gave me. I've even been accused of thinking something is not as funny as I should have because I don't laugh as much as they do, or my face doesn't look like I found something humorous enough. In the past, I've had to force unnatural laughter because even when I do find something really funny on the inside, I don't always laugh or show that on the outside. I actually remember doing this in my teenage years with one of my best friends from high school. Fast forward to being an adult, and I had a situation where a friend asked me if I was drunk because apparently I overdid it on what I thought was appropriate laughter in response to something funny she had said. I wasn't. I hadn't had a drop of alcohol. And there were several times when my daughter would ask me what was wrong or think I was upset. The ironic thing is that I actually find amusement, joy, and hilarity everywhere, but my face just doesn't always show it the same way other people's do. So unfortunately, I feel like I sometimes come off like a humorless wet blanket when I'm actually not. And I'm sure you're thinking, but Jennifer, you're so expressive in this video. That's called acting. And I'm not talking about being fake. I'm bearing so much of my authentic self to you guys in this video that it's outside my comfort zone, and I'm probably going to scare off any future employment opportunities. But filming a video is very different from everyday life. I literally have a written script that I'm going by in these videos. How I look and act in normal everyday life without a camera and a script is very different. As you can imagine, all this abnormal body language or lack of facial expression that falls under nonverbal communication deficits can lead our peers to greatly misunderstand us. And it can be hard to genuinely connect with people when I have to divert such a large amount of focus on what my face looks like, the tone of my voice, if I'm laughing too much or too little, or if I seem engaged enough that there's little focus left over to pay attention to what they're actually saying. Not only is this amount of effort exhausting, it can leave us ruminating on every social interaction far after it's over. As a matter of fact, I get so overwhelmed by all of this that I can have difficulty remembering people's names, job titles, how old someone is, or even how I'm related to a certain relatives I've met 100 times. This actually makes me want to avoid people entirely sometimes because I don't want to embarrass myself not knowing things about them that I should. Now, there are some humans that I feel so comfortable around that I can have intelligent conversations with. And then there are people or situations like networking with professionals and colleagues, for example, where I suddenly forget how to word good. When I'm alone in the quietness of my brain, I don't have this issue, but when I open up my mouth to speak, it can be a different story. And people notice that we're different. There's a concept called uncanny valley where something seems so human or lifelike, but you can tell there's just something off about it. An example of this might be a robot that appears to have human cognition and emotions, but you know they can't because they're a robot. Or scenes in a computer-generated animation that look eerily lifelike. There's a few in Toy Story 2 and Polar Express that come to mind. I feel like this concept kind of describes a lot of autistics. We look normal, but people can tell there's just something a little bit off about us, and they can't quite put their finger on it. This usually ends up in ostracization. I remember one time in the office that I used to work at was invited to a party at a coworker's house over the weekend, except me. They talked about it right in front of me the next Monday morning in the most unapologetic manner you can imagine. If you think this behavior stops after you get out of high school, try working in an office for a while. But I'm not mad at them. The thing is, they all knew something was off about me and they felt uncomfortable around me. They weren't always that mean to me, and they did include me in some other things, but for the most part, I just didn't fit in with them. Historically, one of the coping mechanisms I've used to get through social interactions has been drinking. Alcohol seemed to be the only way I could people, and I never understood why until now. And as you can imagine, this pattern created a vicious cycle. I already needed days to recover from social interactions without alcohol. Add in the adverse physical effects from drinking, and it only made that exhaustion and recovery period worse, meaning I needed it more the next time I had to interact with society. Now, I wasn't an alcoholic by any means, but I couldn't seem to engage without it. It should be noted that people with autism or ADHD are at an increased risk for substance abuse, so anyone with one or both of these diagnoses should be aware of this fact and tread very carefully. Since my diagnosis, I've been able to mitigate my social interactions to remove the need for it in the first place, so I am making accommodations to take better care of myself. Now, with all of that said, you would think I hated people and hid under my bed 24/7 or something, but that's not true. I can and do enjoy hanging out with people, but to quote Dr. Tony Atwood, I tend to do better when activities are short, focused, and activity-based, like board games, for example. I don't do well in social engagements where the social engagement is the purpose and the goal, but get me together for board game night or Texas Hold'em and I'm all in. No pun intended. Don't tell me I don't understand puns and sarcasm. I tend to impress someone the first time I meet them because I'm full of one-liners and new stories. It's the second and third meeting that you begin to realize I'm maybe a little bit different, which is part of the reason it's difficult for me to maintain relationships. However, I do have one friend, so the myth that autistic people never have any friends isn't true. But any of the friends I've had throughout my life were only because they were persistent and patient with me. I also prefer deep conversation over small talk, but let's be real. Hello, my name is Jennifer. Would you like to discuss the meaning of life? Isn't really a socially acceptable intro, apparently. I'm extremely conflict averse and I shut down in difficult discussions. I also have the tendency to go nonverbal for hours or days at a time if I'm tired or overwhelmed. I definitely prefer to be alone, but at the same time, I have the same need for human connection that everyone else has. They're contradictory desires that almost feel like oil and water at times, and it can be a difficult balancing act to manage. It's like when you let your dog out because he's begging to go outside, but the minute you let him outside, he wants back in. That's what social contact kind of feels like for me. I really want someone to talk to. I need connection. I really wish everyone would just go away and leave me alone. I'm also guilty of autistic scripting. If you've been in this community for any amount of time, you've probably heard people talk about this. I can't tell you how many times I've spent an entire drive rehearsing what I'm going to talk about with someone I'm meeting up with. I also tend to respond to people in a scripted manner based on a buzzword. And I don't know if that really falls under scripting because technically it's not pre-planned, but definitely causes me to repeat myself a lot and makes the flow of conversation disjointed. For example, if anyone talks about a cat, regardless of context, I'll probably tell them how much I love cats and could have them if I could, but I can't because I'm allergic. If someone saw a cat walking around the neighborhood and mentioned it to a neurotypical person, the neurotypical person would most likely respond in a contextual manner. Is that cat lost? Is it someone's pet? Do you think it's a stray? Or if someone was complaining about an expensive vet bill for their cat that they weren't planning on, a neurotypical person might respond by discussing pet insurance or recommending a cheaper vet, etc. It's unlikely in either scenario that the other participant in that conversation would work into that conversation that they actually love cats but can't have one as a pet because of their allergies every time. The words that are coming out of my mouth are technically about cats, but they aren't really related to the context of the conversation. So you can see how this can seem uncomfortably disjointed on the person to the other end and how this falls under that uncanny valley concept. You mentioned animals. Let me tell you how much I love crows and carry peanuts in my car to feed them if I see one. True story, by the way. Forget the fact that the actual topic of conversation was your volunteer work. You mentioned volunteering at an animal shelter once, and I heard the buzzword animal. My brain attempts to relate and jams my love of crows into your conversation about volunteer work. Someone mentioned real estate. I'll share the same information about the real estate economy I read in an article from 6 months ago over and over again. Want to talk about something theological? I'll recite the same parables or stories that I personally think relate to that subject. You get the point. It causes me to repeat myself a lot. The people in my life have a lot of patience with me. Remember those farm animal toys we all had when we were younger where we would pull the lever and whatever animal that arrow landed on was the sound that came out? I feel like this is kind of like that. And my dad was so annoyingly bad at this that I would sometimes finish his stories and sentences for him. Spoiler alert. He's the one I inherited my autism from. I've also always been largely uninterested in mainstream culture. I've never really been into the current fashion trends or name brands and have had little to no interest in pop culture. Not only can this make you stand out, it can make conversation difficult when you're not a part of what everyone else in the world seems to be talking about. And finally, I'll touch on my deficits in emotional reciprocity. This trait can mimic a lack of empathy for those on the spectrum. However, we know this might just be misinterpretation of social cues like facial expressions, for example, and not because autistics lack empathy. An article in the American Journal of Psychiatry suggests lack of SERs associated with an inadequate appreciation of social emotional cues as shown by lack of response to other people's emotions. But a lot of the literature now admits that this has been poorly studied and may be less apparent in girls who are more socially motivated. For me personally, I have no issues identifying social cues. I just struggle with being affectionate in response to the emotions of others. I experience great discomfort when anyone is crying or being emotional, and unfortunately, not even my own kids were an exception. And sadly, this is more socially acceptable for males and fathers, but if a female struggles with this exact same thing, it really stands out. It is so hard for me to deal with emotions and crying. I can't even begin to describe the toe-curling, hair-prickling, breath-holding feeling I get whenever anyone I'm around is sad and crying. It makes me want to run away and hide. When my daughter cried over her first breakup, for example, I couldn't bring myself to rush in and hold her and wipe away the tears like a good mom is supposed to do. Whenever either one of my kids cried or got hurt, my husband had to do most of the comforting. And at this point, some of you might be picking up your phone to call Child Protective Services.
Hello, 911?
But hear me out. I'm not a monster or a bad mom. I'm autistic. People on the spectrum tend to show love through acts of service and not through social reciprocity. My husband may have done most of the comforting, but I didn't have an issue with caretaking, which is different from comforting because caretaking is more like an act of service. I guess the best way to describe it is like a doctor with no bedside manner. He'll treat your injury or illness, but he may not show much emotion or compassion beyond that. So, the first breakup my daughter went through, I did an act of service by picking her up from school early and taking her to lunch. But I was extremely uncomfortable with the subsequent crying during lunch. When my kids got hurt, I would give them Band-Aids or make them food to feel better. But in that moment when they're crying right after they got hurt, I freeze up. My daughter's older now, and she recently confided in me that if she had to critique anything about my parenting, it was my inability to provide the physical affection and emotional support that other mothers give their children. And I know she was right. Imagine my feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and shame, knowing that most women, especially mothers, are supposed to be emotional, soft, caring, affectionate, and compassionate. And meanwhile, I'm over here like...
Please stop. Stop. Stop it. Stop crying. Stop crying. Stop crying. Stop.
Interestingly enough, the term refrigerator mothers was coined in the 1950s that may have been based on the observations of mothers like me. It was a theory that was introduced by an Austrian psychiatrist named Leo Kanner beginning in the 1940s, and it concluded that lack of maternal warmth was what caused autism. After a couple of decades, the theory that autism was a disorder of parenting gained widespread acceptance among medical establishments and the public. Now that we know that autism has a large hereditary component, the likelihood is that what those psychologists were observing unknowingly was the genetic link of mothers who had autistic children being less affectionate because they themselves had autism. You know, a lot of people ask, why does getting a diagnosis matter if you've made it all these years without one? And it's because of things like this. Realizing that I'm not a bad, uncaring person and that I just show my love in a different way made a world of difference in my mental health and view of myself. It has allowed me to make accommodations in social interactions to take better care of my physical and emotional well-being. And it's allowed me to make cognitive efforts to overcome my deficits where possible on behalf of the people in my life that I care about, without that added guilt that I'm just a horrible person who's really bad at life. I want to sum up this video with a quote from Sarah Hendricks, who said, "They say you're smart, so you can get on in the world, but that's not really how it works, is it?" What that means is people think that if you're not intellectually disabled and have a decent amount of intelligence, you should be able to get through life just like everyone else, but that's not really how it works. is it? A person can have all the intelligence or education in the world, but if they're deemed to be socially awkward, they may not get on as easily in their career as a person who happens to have an outgoing and engaging personality can. The social deficits that come with autism can have one of the biggest impacts on our lives. My whole life, I've always felt like a fly on the wall and like I've never belonged anywhere. It seemed like everyone else was able to glide through life so easily, and I was just doing something wrong. I've always been extremely inside my own head, a daydreamer and a loner. As a child, I didn't want to hang out with the other kids. I wanted the safety of hanging out with the adults, like teachers or camp counselors. And as an adult, I feel immature and less like a real adult than the other adultier adults. In this video, I did my best to show examples of what this could look like for an adult and in my own life, but what this looks like for you might be different. It's like they always say, if you've met one autistic person, congratulations, you've met one autistic person. But if you really are on the spectrum, you will experience some form of difficulty with social interactions in a way that is persistent from childhood and greatly impacts your day-to-day life. As I wrap up this video, there's a few final thoughts that I want to share with you. First, in case you didn't notice, I only included experiences from my adulthood in these videos. The missed signs from my childhood will be its own future video because there are a plethora.
Jefe, what is a plethora?
Secondly, I'd like to apologize in advance for any times I've used the terms symptoms, traits, and mannerisms interchangeably. Since autism and ADHD aren't diseases, symptoms isn't really the correct adjective to use. But in my mind, there is a sense of a diagnostics process that I went through, so that's why I've used it here and there. But it's important to point out that autism and ADHD are hardwired, not acquired. Thirdly, all of the things that I've shared with you in this video were things that I experienced before my diagnosis. These weren't behaviors that I acquired because I saw a video on the internet that planted ideas in my head. I wasn't looking for a label. I was looking to make sense of my life. And finally, a lot of the times people will unknowingly invalidate the diagnosis of someone who's on the spectrum by saying, we're all a little autistic, because they themselves experience most of these traits in a way that looks identical. But as I've said throughout this video, it's not what the trait looks like on the outside. Think of it like baking a cake. An egg on its own isn't a cake, but it's often part of a cake. You have to put the egg together with other specific and measured ingredients before it can become a cake. Great. I want cake. So, like in this example, it's not until you put all these traits together in a particular way that it becomes autism, ADHD, or some other form of neurodivergence. So that's it. Hopefully I'll see you in my next two videos where I'll share even more of my weirdness with you. You know, for educational purposes. Bye for now. Mwah.